I urgently called Edward, explaining that our parents were gravely ill and that he needed to return home immediately. Despite my heartfelt pleas, he dismissed my concerns coldly, insisting he was too tied up with a work trip and accusing me of overreacting. He abruptly ended the call, ignoring my attempts to keep him on the line. For weeks later, when Edward finally returned home, indifferent and distant, I had the painful task of telling him that he had missed both of our parents' funerals. Shocked and bewildered, he couldn't comprehend what I was saying, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke. I reminded him of the call I made, warning him about their critical health condition, and his face fell as regret washed over him, leaving him speechless. My name is Janet Rachel, a 51-year-old woman who has devoted her life to family, stepping away from a promising career in administration after marriage. My journey with Edward began in college, where we connected through our shared love for paddle. Initially, our relationship was strained. Edward, the leader of the paddle club and focused on national competitions, was harsh and demanding. He only cared about skill, not the experience, and I often found myself relegated to the sidelines, picking up balls after failing to meet his high expectations. But my frustration turned into determination. I practiced relentlessly in private, and during a practice session, to everyone's surprise, including Edward's, I successfully returned one of his challenging serves. That moment earned his respect and admiration, and for the first time, our relationship shifted from animosity to a budding connection. From that point on, my feelings for Edward deepened, despite his continued strict demeanor. I found myself falling for him, and our bond grew stronger. During one of our monthly gatherings, after a social night, Edward unexpectedly confessed his feelings for me, admitting he had fallen in love. Surprised but elated, I eagerly accepted, and we decided to keep our relationship a secret from the club to avoid disrupting the team dynamics. I was so in love that the secrecy didn't matter. Being with Edward was all I wanted. Our relationship endured beyond college, and we married when I was 23. At Edward's suggestion, I left my job to commit to being by his side. I was completely captivated by him, imagining a bright future together. Now, 25 years later, our life has settled into a more predictable routine. The excitement of our early days has given way to a comfortable, familiar life. My attention to personal style has relaxed. Where once I meticulously chose outfits and applied makeup for every date, I now favor comfort and rarely wear makeup. As a homemaker who rarely interacts with anyone outside our home, I've embraced a natural look. Reflecting on these changes, I can't help but notice how much I've changed since my younger years. I've gained weight, and my appearance now mirrors the before photos seen in weight loss ads. This shift in how I look might be contributing to the more routine nature of our relationship, and I sense that Edward now sees me less as a passionate partner and more as a maternal figure. He even makes light-hearted comments, asking for coffee in a way that feels more like a caretaker's role than a wife's. This gradual transformation in our dynamic marks a significant evolution from those early days of love and ambition. Edward's parents live just a 20-minute walk away, and they have always been kind and supportive. In return, I visit them often, eager to help, especially as their health has been failing. My father-in-law is battling a serious illness, and the doctors have given him little hope. He expressed a wish to spend his remaining days at home, and we brought him home for palliative care. The strain has been heavy on my mother-in-law, who seems increasingly worn out by the burden of caring for him. As someone who doesn't work outside the home, I've tried to step in and support, but the toll of it all is beginning to weigh on me as well. I've been helping my mother-in-law nearly every day, yet it's clear that the full responsibility of caring for my father-in-law falls on her shoulders, and it's visibly taking a toll. One evening, she asked if I could stay the night to assist her, her voice filled with hope. I had to decline, though, because Edward, my husband, expects me to be home every night. My refusal left her disheartened, her disappointment clear. Edward has a commanding presence, and he's never been one to help with household chores. He expects dinner to be ready and the house in order when he returns, and leftovers are not an option. Any deviation from his expectations often leads to an intense reaction. One day, I arrived home late after helping my father-in-law, only to be met with Edward's anger. He prioritized his needs over his father's, and I remained silent, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. This dynamic has left me feeling trapped. As a homemaker, I feel guilty for not standing up to Edward or offering my mother-in-law the support she needs during this difficult time. Edward's behavior has been increasingly erratic. He often comes home late without notice, sometimes clearly intoxicated, and his excuse is always the same: he has the right to spend his money however he pleases. This pattern has left me feeling isolated, torn between my duties as a wife and my desire to support my in-laws. Despite my role at home, Edward's expectations have become harder to accept. His frequent nights out were beginning to concern me, not just for our family, but for the families of those he spent time with. Edward, with his authoritative position at work, often used his power to pressure colleagues into socializing after hours. He would boast about always going out with the same coworker, a man who lived alone and was single, claiming that his colleague was always eager for company and drinks. I tried suggesting a compromise to Edward, asking if he could inform me ahead of time about his plans so I could better support his parents, especially with his father's worsening health and his mother's increasing stress. But Edward dismissed my concerns with a laugh, insisting his outings were spontaneous and that his mother could manage on her own. He prioritized his needs over everything, even rushing me through household tasks, without regard for my feelings. Then, unexpectedly, Edward announced he was planning a 3-week trip to Thailand. I was stunned, filled with questions. He had taken the initiative to request time off work and had already thought about what he wanted to do and eat there. When I asked about the sudden trip and mentioned that I didn't have a passport, he casually replied that it didn't matter because I wouldn't be joining him. This was particularly surprising, since we hadn't even gone on a proper honeymoon. Given his usual stance on saving money, curious and concerned, I asked who he would be traveling with. His response was curt: he was going with a coworker, and then he quickly shifted the conversation to ask about dinner. I knew pressing for more details would likely lead to an argument, so I reluctantly accepted the situation, my frustration simmering as I prepared dinner just as Edward wished. On the day of his departure, he left early in the morning, beginning his trip without a word of further discussion. By noon, I found myself reflecting on the dynamics of our relationship, recognizing how difficult it was to express my needs and concerns within the constraints set by Edward's behavior and expectations. In a moment of urgency, I called Edward, only to be met with impatience. "What do you want? I'm about to board a plane," he snapped, irritation clear in his voice. I pleaded with him, explaining the dire state of his parents' health and urging him to reconsider his trip. But Edward dismissed me coldly, claiming he was on vacation and telling me to handle the situation myself. His lack of empathy stung as he hung up, leaving my calls unanswered thereafter. Murmuring a quiet promise of regret, I resigned myself to waiting for his return 3 weeks later. When Edward finally came back, he seemed unaffected by the events that had unfolded in his absence. I confronted him with the news of his parents' passing, and he reacted with disbelief, questioning me as if I were playing a cruel joke. I explained the heartbreaking details of how his parents had deteriorated and passed away, despite my constant visits and care. Their sudden decline was something I couldn't prevent, and the guilt weighed heavily on me. My anger toward Edward grew, fueled by the memory of his parents' suffering and his complete disregard for their well-being. It was clear he had always placed his own desires above his family's needs, a fact that was impossible to ignore in the face of such tragedy. Confronting him, I accused him of prioritizing a leisure trip over the well-being of his parents. Edward's silence spoke volumes. He seemed unable to face the reality of his choices and the consequences they had brought. In that moment, my disappointment and frustration with him were overwhelming. His carefree demeanor after returning from his vacation stood in sharp contrast to the grim situation at home, underscoring the profound selfishness of his actions. My heart ached, not just for the loss of my in-laws, but also for the realization that the man I had hoped would stand by me in difficult times had chosen himself above all else. With a hint of sarcasm, I probed further, asking about his recent 4-week getaway, suggesting it might have been with a lover. Edward, seemingly defeated, admitted to his affair with Donna, a younger coworker who, in his words, brought him comfort like nothing I could. His confession revealed that his late nights weren't spent working late but with Donna, and he boasted about her qualities in comparison to mine, arrogantly undermining my worth. What came next was even more shocking. With his parents no longer around to object, Edward bluntly suggested a divorce, envisioning a future where he could live with Donna in our home, effectively telling me to leave. The proposal hit me like a blow to the chest. Having dedicated my life to being a homemaker at Edward's request, I had no income of my own and little confidence to start over, but the realization that he had chosen his mistress over attending to his ailing parents was the final straw. With firm resolve, I left him for good. I packed only the essentials and soon found refuge in a budget motel. A week into my new reality, Edward's call broke my peace. His voice was panicked over a missing checkbook. Unfazed, I informed him that the financial documents and accounts under his name were untouched at home, only the checkbook was missing. I had taken only what was mine, the savings I had built up over time and the gifts from my family, all safely tucked away in an account in my name. It wasn't part of our joint property, and I had no obligation to share it with him. Edward, however, was desperate. He had squandered his salary and bonus on his lavish trip and was now hoping to dip into my savings to cover his recklessness. For the first time, it became clear to me just how much Edward had taken my financial stability for granted. He expected me to clean up his mess, but I refused. I suggested he get an advance from his paycheck if he needed money that badly. It was his responsibility to face the consequences of his actions, not mine. As the conversation wore on, I couldn't help but fill him in on the harsh financial reality of his parents' situation. There would be no significant inheritance coming his way. His parents had lived off their pensions, and his father's healthcare costs had eaten through almost everything they had. I also warned him to vacate their rental apartment to avoid further costs. It was a reality check he clearly wasn't ready for, and he struggled to grasp it. With a newfound sense of independence, I told Edward he was on his own. I had no obligation to support him anymore. His reaction, full of disbelief and desperation, did nothing to sway me. His previous actions had already drained any sympathy I might have had for him. I couldn't help but laugh at his situation. After all, this mess was his own doing. His affair with Donna and the way he'd thrown me out of our home without considering the financial implications had brought him to this point. His concerns about his job and the potential fallout from his affair were of no concern to me. I made it clear that he and Donna were the architects of their downfall, and I had no pity for them. Edward continued to plead, acknowledging his mistakes, but I remained unmoved. I ended the call with a final warning of regret, and that was it. Any obligations I had to him were over. The divorce process began soon after. Edward was initially hesitant, mostly due to financial concerns and the fear of his actions becoming public, but eventually, he was convinced by legal counsel to proceed. The divorce marked the end of a chapter defined by his betrayal and financial mismanagement. Thanks to my lawyer's expertise, the division of assets was favorable for me. Edward, who had already wasted most of his savings, found himself in a precarious financial situation after the divorce. He struggled to make ends meet, even dealing with the fallout from having to clear out his parents' apartment and cover the rental costs. Donna, who had originally sought Edward for professional gain, quickly distanced herself when the affair became public. She saw no further use for him and moved on, leaving Edward even more isolated. After everything unraveled, Edward sought to reconnect with me indirectly through our lawyer. His attempts to win me back and request financial assistance were relayed to me with a hint of irony. The desperation in his voice as he begged for help only reinforced my decision to cut ties with him completely. His financial struggles and inability to manage his life after the divorce were a direct consequence of his own decisions. Meanwhile, I had begun to move forward. I decided to re-enter the workforce and landed a part-time job at a local convenience store. It was a brand new experience for me, and I found myself enjoying it far more than I expected. I quickly adapted to the physical demands, whether it was manning the register, managing inventory, or keeping the store tidy. The work was a welcome change, and my manager even mentioned that I might secure a permanent position. It was a small, but hopeful, step toward rebuilding my life. Looking back, I see this chapter not as a decline, but as a midpoint full of potential. The end of my marriage wasn't a setback, but a launchpad for new beginnings. As I navigate this next phase of life, I do so with a renewed sense of purpose and joy, eager to embrace whatever opportunities lie ahead.